The Rock and Roll Unraveled Show.
I'm Derek Shelmerdine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled show. Today we're taking a look at the Beatles before they became the Fab Four, when Ringo joined them. They spent 5 years slogging away before Love Me Do took them into the UK charts on the 11th of October 1962. Well, the story starts back in early 1957. John Lennon and his little mate Paul Shotton formed the Blackjacks, and shortly afterwards they renamed to the Quarrymen, and they were inspired for the name because they both went to Quarry Bank High School. Now, the story of the Beatles really starts on the 6th of July 1957 when John met Paul for the first time, and it was when Paul went to see John's group, the Quarrymen, performing at St Peter's Church Fete in Woolton. And Paul had been taken there by his friend Ivan Vaughan. And after the Quarrymen set, Paul auditioned for them and impressed them very much with his knowledge of all of the words to Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock. Well, a couple of weeks later, Paul was a Quarryman. And the lineup at the gig was John Lennon, guitar and vocals, Pete Shotton, washboard, Rod Davis, banjo, Eric Griffiths, guitar, Len Gary, T-chest, bass, and Colin Hanton, drums. Now, you might wonder what a washboard and T-chest bass were. Well, this is a skiffle group, and that's basically the rhythm section. The washboard was a corrugated steel device that your mother used for the Monday wash when she washed all the clothes, and a T-chest bass was exactly that. It was a bass, an upright bass, essentially constructed out of a T-chest, a box basically, with a broom handle and a single string. Very much anybody can be in a group affair. And the set itself, well, they played things like Come Go With Me from the Del Vikings, Bebop-A-Lula, Gene Vincent. And George Harrison, well, he was setting off. He hadn't actually met the lads yet, but in late 57 he was in a group called the Rebels with his brother Peter, and they both played guitar and vocals. Now, the 7th of August is one for the Beatles calendar, and that was when John Lennon with his Quarrymen made their first appearance at the Cavern Club. And at that time it was very much a jazz club. It was owned by Alan Sitner, who was absolutely not a fan of rock and roll. And the Quarrymen were there as a skiffle group. And John Lennon, well, he was really moving very much in the rock and roll direction. And during the set, they broke away from the more traditional skiffle numbers and played things like Hound Dog and Blue Suede Shoes. Much to Alan Sitner's dismay, and Sitner famously sent a note to John Lennon while he was still on stage, telling him to cut out the bloody rock. By now, Paul McCartney, well, he was a member of the Quarrymen, but he missed this particular gig because he was away at camp with the Boy Scouts. It's worth just mentioning a little bit about the background to skiffle, because, well, that's very much where John Lennon and his Quarrymen started out. In America, the teenagers were very much getting into rock and roll. In the early 1950s, rock and roll was developing out of blues, R&B, country music and other genres, and it really burst onto the scene in the mid-1950s. Very different story in the UK. The UK, the young people of the time were very into trad jazz, traditional jazz, and that was a UK take, a very British take on New Orleans jazz. And these trad jazz bands, particularly the larger ones, would have interval skiffle groups. And when the jazz band guys were taking their break, some of them, possibly with other musicians, would then play a skiffle set during the interval. Now, skiffle very much had its roots in US rural blues. And one of the most famous of these bands, of course, was Chris Barber, and that was where Lonnie Donegan's skiffle group was the breakout, the interval group. And it was January 56 when Rock Island Line, coupled with John Henry, entered the charts and really started the whole skiffle boom. And both of those tracks were from American rural blues artist Lead Belly. And John Lennon's often said that his inspiration came from that particular song. That's what inspired him to pick up the guitar. And of course, he formed the Quarrymen. They were a skiffle group. And these skiffle groups developed into the British rock and roll bands. Well, let's get back to the plot. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, Paul missed the Quarrymen's debut at the Cavern Club because he was away at Boy Scout camp. Paul's first appearance with the Quarrymen came on the 18th of October at the Conservative Club in Norris Green. Conservative clubs were very much the venues that the groups would be playing in the late 50s and early 60s. And Paul played lead guitar at this stage. Probably he was overcome by stage fright when it came to his guitar solo in Guitar Boogie. And situation was sorted out shortly afterwards when George Harrison took over the duties of lead guitar. And George, in fact, joined the Quarrymen at the beginning of February 1958. George was actually Paul's friend, and they auditioned for John on a double-decker bus. And John was a little reluctant at first when he met George, because George was that little bit younger than Paul and John. But when he played Bill Justice's Raunchy, which was actually a hit at the time, gave him a number 11, John Lennon quickly changed his mind and George came on board as the third member. Now, one of the landmark dates in the Beatles' diary is the first recording. This is the Quarrymen's first recording session on the 12th of July 1958, or it could have been the 14th of July 1958. There's a little bit of discrepancy. There's a studio log which lists the date as the 12th of July, and there's a blue plaque, one of these so-and-so lived here plaques, and that gives the date as the 14th of July, and the venue was Philips Sound Recording Service. Not the one in Memphis, but the one in Liverpool 7. This was Percy Phillips' recording studio at 38 Kensington. And the lineup for that historic demo was John, Paul and George, all on guitar and vocals, Colin Hanton on drums and John Lowe piano. And the recording cost varies as well. The blue plaque has it that they paid 17 and 6 for the recording. That's about 87 pence. And the studio log has it that it was just 11 and 3, around 55 pence. They recorded a couple of songs. That'll Be the Day, the Buddy Holly cover, and one of their own, In Spite of All the Danger. But what's interesting about that, it was written by Paul and George. So the first recorded Beatles song actually wasn't Lennon McCartney, interestingly enough. They recorded a 10-inch 78 RPM acetate, and it's inscribed with recorded by P.F. Phillips. And they decided they'd keep it for a week each. So John kept it for a week, gave it to Paul, who gave it to George, who gave it to Colin Hanton, who gave it to John Lowe. But John Lowe hung on to it for the next 23 years, although Paul did buy it from him in the early 1980s. And from that historic recording session, this is the Quarrymen with That'll Be the Day. After making that recording in the July of 1958, things went very quiet for the Quarrymen. They really didn't play an awful lot of gigs in the second half of 58 or the first half of 59. In fact, in the January of 59, Colin Hanton left the Quarrymen. He'd been the drummer. And George decided to also join another local band. And he was with the Les Stewart Quartet. Now, the lineup there included Les Stewart, George Harrison and Ken Brown, and they were all guitar and vocals. But things really started to hot up on the 29th of August 1959. The Casbah Club opened. Now, Casbah was one of the legendary Liverpool clubs of this era. And the Les Stewart Quartet were due to play that night. But as with all bands, they had a bit of a row at one of the practices, and George and Ken Brown actually walked out on the other two. And in fact, George then got in contact with his Quarrymen mates and said, how do you fancy playing at the Casbah's opening night? And they said, oh yes, that sounds good. So instead of the Les Stewart Quartet playing, the Quarrymen played, and that was John, Paul, George and Ken Brown. But not on the scene just yet, Pete Best. Mention him because it was his mother, Mona Best, who actually owned the Casbah Club. Now, Ken Brown parted company with the band in the October, so it left just John, Paul and George, again all guitar and vocals, and they decided to change their name from the Quarrymen to Johnny and the Moondogs. And on the 26th of October, Johnny and the Moondogs went on Carol Levis's talent show, TV Star Search. It was the sort of X Factor of its day, and this was the start of a week of finals at Liverpool Empire. They didn't actually win this regional heat. That was an accolade that was taken away by the Connaughts. And as an aside, the Connaughts were previously the Sunnyside Skiffle group, and they'd actually beaten the Beatles in the same Carol Levis show a couple of years earlier in the June of 57. And when they won then, they were calling themselves the Sunnyside Skiffle Group. But Johnny and the Moondogs did qualify for the finals, and they were in Manchester in mid-November. And now we find a bass player finally making his way into the band. And it was the 17th of November that the John Moore's exhibition opened, very prestigious exhibition, in Liverpool's Walker Art Gallery. And it included exhibits by Stuart Sutcliffe and the abstract expressionist piece of his The Summer Painting. Now, at the end of the exhibition in mid-January, John Moores purchased that particular painting for £65. Now, Sutcliffe was a friend of John Lennon at art school, and John invited him to join the Moondogs. And he thought, oh yes, that sounds good, being a group. So he used his £65 and he went off and bought a Hofner President bass guitar. So in early January, Stuart Sutcliffe became the fourth member of the group. And when he joined, they changed their name again, this time to the Beatles. Now the spelling of Beatles has varied quite a bit in these early days. And this first name they used was spelled Beatals. And the inspiration for the name was very much accredited to John and Stu Sutcliffe. Now the band's name, sort of a couple of sources get attributed to this. One, that it was the doff of a cap to Buddy Holly's band, The Crickets. Remember, it was a cricket song they covered, or Buddy Holly and the cricket song they covered in their first recording session. And also there was a 1953 film starring Marlon Brando called The Wild One. And in that was a leather-clad motorcycle gang called the Beatles, spelled B-E-E-T-L-E-S. And you can imagine a combination of those two things. You can see how the Beatles name came together. And in the May, Tommy Moore joined them as the new drummer. And again, when he joined, they changed their name, this time to the Silver Beatles, and that's B-E-E-T-L-E-S. And on the 10th of May 1960, they famously failed their audition to back Billy Fury. And the band now, of course, is John, Paul and George on guitar, Stu Sutcliffe on bass and Tommy Moore on drums. And Larry Parnes was up looking for a backing band for his artist Billy Fury, another big Liverpool name at the time. And Alan Williams, who'd been getting the Beatles quite a few gigs around the area, he'd arranged an audition at his Wyvern Social Club in Liverpool. Now, Tommy Moore was late for the audition, and Johnny Hutchinson of Cass and the Casanovas, another well-respected Liverpool band of the time, he stood in for the absent Moore for part of the audition. They never got to back Billy Fury, but they did back one of Larry Parnes' other artists, and that was Johnny Gentle, and they went off on a Scottish tour with him. And in fact, Tommy Moore quit the group and went back to his day job at the end of that particular tour. Now, Billy Fury's next hit, That's Love, entered the chart shortly after this audition, a couple of weeks after, and it gave him a number 19. It was Billy Fury's fourth UK hit at that time. It was written by Billy Fury, and the label credits Billy Fury with the 4Js. Now, the 4Js, of course, became the Foremost. So a little bit of imagination and try and think what this might have sounded like with the Beatles behind him. And this is Billy Fury with That's Love. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with the Rock and Roll Unravelled Show. Today we're looking at the Beatles before Ringo joined and they became that Fab Four. They slogged away for 5 years before their first UK hit in October 1962. But before continuing with the story, there's an opportunity to win my book, well, a signed copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Every month I run a quiz in conjunction with this Rock and Roll Unravelled show, and for the current quiz, just check out the top of the homepage on my website, rockandrollunraveled.com. Follow the link to the quiz, send me the answer, and I'll send a signed copy of Rock and Roll Unravelled to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Now, Rock and Roll Unravelled tells the story of rock and roll from its roots to mid-70s punk. And Record Collector magazine's review described the book as comprehensive and invaluable. Thank you very much, Record Collector. Well, good luck with the competition. Meanwhile, back at the plot. Well, the 13th of June 1960 was Tommy Moore's last gig, and that was the Jacaranda Club, because he'd left after the Scottish tour backing Johnny Gentle finished. Now, in the June also of 1960, John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe played behind beat poet Royston Ellis, also at the Jacaranda Club. And they called themselves that day the Dissenters, and they were with a couple of mates, Rod Murray and Bill Harry. And shortly after this gig, there was a subtle name change from Silver Beatles with a double E to Silver Beatles with an EA. Obviously, they were impressed by Royston Ellis and the whole beat scene. Now, Norman Chapman joined as drummer just for a handful of gigs shortly after that, and it was in the August of 1960 that the Beatles saw Pete Best playing at the Casbah Club with his own band, who were the residents, obviously, the Blackjacks, but the Blackjacks were disbanding, so the Beatles offered Pete Best an audition, which he duly accepted and passed, as it were. Now, one of the reasons they were looking for a drummer was that Alan Williams, he's the guy that arranged the Billy Fury audition, and he got them quite a lot of work around the Liverpool northwest area. He'd secured them a gig in Hamburg, but only if they had a drummer. So on the 17th of August 1960, they were off on their first Hamburg trip with Pete Best, who was actually really their first permanent drummer. This was also the last of the name changes. When they set off for Hamburg, they decided to call themselves the Beatles with the EA, and that name stuck. They opened at the Indra Club in Hamburg's red light district, so now the band is John, Paul and George guitar and vocals, bassist Stu Sutcliffe and drummer Pete Best. And while they were out there on the 15th of October, it was the first time that the four Beatles, that's the actual Fab Four, John, Paul, George and Ringo, it was the first time they recorded together. They made an amateur recording at the small acoustic studio in Hamburg. And what happened, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were over there in Hamburg at the same time, and they made the recording with Walter Amond, who called himself Lou Walters or Wally. He was the bass player, and the Hurricanes drummer was Ringo Starr. And they got together and recorded Summertime from Porgy and Bess. Now, Summertime dates back to the opening on Broadway of 1935. But the whole first trip to Hamburg ended in ignominy, really. End of November, early December. 3 of the band were deported. George was the first to go for working underage, and he was followed fairly shortly afterwards by Paul and Pete for alleged arson. And it was early December when John came back, and he was the only Beatle to arrive home without being deported. But so had Stu Sutcliffe. He actually stayed on in Hamburg. He'd met Astrid Kircher, a professional photographer who took a lot of the iconic Hamburg photographs, and he stayed on in Hamburg with her. So when they got back, of course, there was Sans, a bass player, And on the 17th of December, Chas Newby stood in for the first time. And that was, of course, the first time they'd played as the Beatles in the UK, and that was at the Casbah Coffee Club. Now, Chas Newby had been a friend of Pete Best, and he was in the Blackjacks with Pete Best. He was on vacation from his college course, and he played 4 gigs with the band. The last one on New Year's Eve at the Casbah, and that's when Paul moved to bass, and really the Beatles lineup was complete. He played his first gig as bass guitarist at the Litherland Town Hall on the 5th of January 1961, and they made their first appearance at the Cavern as the Beatles on the 9th of February, and that was, of course, George Harrison's Cavern debut. That was an afternoon session. They didn't play an evening session at the Cavern as the Beatles until the 21st of March. And then in April, beginning of April, they were back to Hamburg for the second trip. This time they played at the Top 10 Club in the Reeperbahn, and Paul was obviously now the bass player. Stu Sutcliffe was not yet officially departed from the Beatles, but this effectively marked the band's move to a quartet. Sutcliffe occasionally joined the guys on stage, but his days as a Beatle were all but finished. And on the 22nd of June, another recording session while they were over in Hamburg, but this time it was actually a commercial session, and it was with Tony Sheridan and producer Bert Kaempfert, and they cut a couple of songs including My Bonnie. And for our next piece of music, this is Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers. Who on earth are the Beat Brothers? Well, we'll find out shortly. Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers with My Bonnie. It's amazing how many of the bands and artists they're talking about in the show are actually on tour now. Now, to check out the latest information for everyone I've mentioned in the show, it's on my website, rockandrollandravel.com. If you look at the top, there's a little section called 1960s, 1970s artists touring now. And take it from me, if they're still alive, there's a very strong chance you'll find these guys are out on the road. And talking of other things you can get for the show, there's a companion blog, and that's got links to all the songs I talk about in the show. So if you want to hear some of these songs, and some are quite rare, again, it's on my website, rockandrollandravel.com. Go to the top and just check out rock and roll history. There's a bunch of other things there as well. Now, going back to the 22nd of June 1961 and that recording of My Bonnie with Tony Sheridan, they actually recorded quite a lot of material that eventually found its way onto an LP, and that was recorded at the Friedrich Ebert Halle in Hamburg, as I mentioned earlier, under the auspices of producer Bert Kaempfert. Now, the Beatles were John, Paul, George and drummer Pete Best. And a couple of songs they recorded, My Bonnie and the Saints, they were traditional songs, but arranged by Tony Sheridan. And that coupling was issued as a single in Germany first, and then it was released in the UK and America, a couple of times in America. And the famous Beatles hairstyle, well, as you'd imagine, there's a story behind that as well. On the 1st of October 1961, John and Paul were in Paris for a couple of weeks. What happened is they were celebrating John's upcoming 21st, and they decided to set off on a hitchhiking holiday to Spain, but they never made it any further than Paris, because that was where they met their old Hamburg friend, Jürgen Vollmer, and he'd moved there to continue his photography studies, and Vollmer wore his hair in the brushed forward style, the X's style, and Lennon McCartney persuaded him to cut their hair in the same style. And that style came about with Stuart Sutcliffe's girlfriend, Astrid Kircher. She introduced the Beatles to her arty friends, and they were known as the X's, a name derived from their sort of existentialist leanings. And this circle of friends included Kircher's current boyfriend, Klaus Voormann. He pops up in the Beatles story and the Plastic Ono Band story. and fellow photographer Jürgen Vollmer. And the X's typically wore their hair in this fringe style, and Kershaw cut Sutcliffe's hair in this style, and John and Paul were obviously keen to follow suit. Now on the 19th of October, the Beatles and Gerry and the Pacemakers were both playing at Litherland Town Hall, and they decided to join forces that night, and for a one-time only performance. They called themselves the Beatmakers and effectively created Liverpool's, probably the world's first, supergroup. And the Beatmakers were guitarists George on lead and Paul on rhythm. John moved to piano. Pete Best and Freddie Marsden shared the drum stool. Les Maguire played his saxophone. Les Chadwick the bass. And Jerry Marsden added some more guitar and vocals. And there was another group playing there that night, Carl Terry and the Cruisers. And Carl added even more vocals. Now, Carl Terry and the Cruisers were one of a very large number of Liverpool groups, very popular in Liverpool, but never really achieved a wider commercial success. And it was the 23rd of October that My Bonnie and the Saints was released in Germany on Polydor, and that was the single that was credited to Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers. Now, the reason the record label felt they needed to change the Beatles name was because it was felt that Beatles sounded a little too much like Pedals, which was the German slang word for penis. And on the 28th of October, famously, Brian Epstein was asked for a copy of My Bonnie in his Nems record store. Now, this might well be an apocryphal story, but it's widely reported. I think it's even in Brian Epstein's own biography. But as the story goes, Raymond Jones walked into Brian Epstein's Nems record store and asked for a copy of the Beatles' My Bonnie. Well, it was actually by Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers and only released in Germany, so he'd never actually come across it, but more requests followed, and this prompted Brian Epstein to hunt out this Beatles group. And he did just that on the 9th of November. He made his first visit to the Cavern to see the Beatles. And it was a lunchtime session. He wanted to see what all the fuss was about. He wanted to see it for himself. Now, another name that's very important on the whole Liverpool scene in the late 50s, early 60s was Sam Leach. He was a major promoter there. And on the 10th of November, he promoted the Beatles at the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton. And interestingly enough, the poster for the gig says, "By kind permission of Mrs. Best," underneath the Beatles' name. Now, there are a number of people who were getting the Beatles gigs and could arguably have become the Beatles manager. And I'll almost certainly I will definitely be doing a show based around these movers and shakers, because it's a really fascinating time in Liverpool rock and roll history. Now, this was the first of Sam Leach's concerts he called Operation Big Beat. And on the 3rd of December, Brian met with the Beatles for the first time to have a chat with them about becoming their manager. And Sam Leach was also contemplating becoming the manager around this time. But there was a very interesting twist of fate. On the 8th of December, the Beatles played Sam Leach's gig at the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton, and they were attracting literally thousands of people to these gigs. And on the 9th of December, Sam Leach actually arranged for them to play their first gig in the south of England. It was at the Palais Ballroom in Aldershot, and the poster said, "Battle of the Bands, Liverpool versus London. Liverpool's #1 rock outfit, the Beatles, versus one of London's top beat groups, Ivor J and the Jaywalkers." Now, the problem was it was very poorly advertised, and famously, literally, only 18 people turned up to witness this southern debut by the Beatles. Now, the following day they were having a meeting with Brian Epstein, and that's when they agreed that he would be their manager. They didn't actually sign any documents until the January. But in a parallel universe somewhere, if that Aldershot gig had gone well, Sam Leach might well have become the Beatles manager, and we might never have heard of Brian Epstein. So there's one to ponder on. Another not so happy day for the boys was on the 1st of January 62. They had their audition for the Decca record company in London, and they failed it. And the audition itself was won by the local London band, Brian Poole and the Tremolos. But what it did, it gave Dick Rowe the eternal fame or infamy as the man who turned down the Beatles. Now, that particular audition, they recorded a colossal 15 songs. There were 3 original numbers. They were all later covered by the people. Hello Little Girl, the foremost in 63, Love of the Loved, Cilla Black in 63, and Like Dreamers Do, the Applejacks in 64. And the remainder were covers. Things like Barrett Strong's Money, Chuck Berry's Memphis, Tennessee, the Teddy Bears, To Know Her Is to Love Her. Now that started life as Phil Spector's first single, and then it was called To Know Him Is to Love Him. Interesting story with that song as well. Now, Hello Little Girl was John Lennon's first ever composition, and it was also recorded by Jerry and the Pacemakers as a possible third single, but they never released that. They opted to go with You'll Never Walk Alone as their third single. But in September 63, it gave the Foremost their first UK hit. They managed to get to number 9 with the song. The Beatles released it on their Anthology 1 in 1995. And from that Decca audition, this is the Beatles version of Hello Little Girl. The 5th of January 1962 saw the UK release of My Bonnie, but this time it was credited to Tony Sheridan and the Beatles. It was released on Polydor, and it was the first recording actually issued as the Beatles in the UK. And it was 10 months before their own debut single, Love Me Do, was to appear. And interestingly enough, on the same day, 5th of January, the album My Bonnie was released in Germany, and again credited to Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers. Now, it was the 10th of April when Stuart Sutcliffe sadly died, and he was just 21. Now, the Beatles didn't actually find out until they arrived in Hamburg a couple of days later for their third Hamburg trip, and that was a 7-week engagement at the Star Club. And that was where they discovered that their friend Stuart had sadly died from a brain hemorrhage. Now, the 23rd of April saw My Bonnie, coupled with the Saints, released in America. And in America, it was initially released on Decca as Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers. And that was their first American release. But it sank without trace. Although, when the British invasion started, it was released again on the 7th of March 1964. It entered the American charts. It gave them a number 26. And it was their 5th American hit. And this time it was released on the MGM label, but the artist credit was very different. It was now credited to the Beatles with Tony Sheridan. And it was the 6th of June that they entered the Abbey Road recording studios for the first time. And this was with Pete Best as the drummer. They recorded 4 songs: Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, Ask Me Why, and for some reason, Besame Mucho. Now, the Pete Best version of Love Me Do wasn't released until Anthology 1 in 1995, because when George Martin signed them up to the Parlophone label, it was very much with a proviso that Pete Best had to go. And a few days later, they played the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton, and that was with Bruce Chanel, who had Hey Baby in the charts. Now, his harmonica player, Delbert McClinton, gave John Lennon some harmonica tips at the gig. And if you listen to the harmonica on the first recording, this one with Pete Best, it's very different to the 2 later versions of Love Me Do. Also on the bill that night were the Big 3 and the 4 J's. Now, the 4 J's became the Foremost. And things are really starting to motor now. On the 23rd of June, Brian Epstein formed his NEMS Enterprises Limited to handle the Beatles' affairs, and it was Brian Epstein that changed their image very much from the leather-clad days of Hamburg to new smart suits. But it was the 15th of August that Pete Best had his last performance at the Cavern, They played both the lunchtime and the evening sessions that particular day. And the following day, he was sacked from the Beatles. And it was almost exactly 2 years to the day of his arrival in the group. And he was obviously replaced by Ringo Starr. Now, Ringo was playing at Butlins with his band Rory Storm and the Hurricane at the times. And they had a couple of gigs between Pete leaving and Ringo joining, and Johnny Hutchinson from the Big Three stood in as drummer for those couple of gigs. And it was Johnny Hutchinson who'd stood in also at the ill-fated Billy Fury audition back in May 1960. At the time he was with Cass and the Casanovas, and when Brian Casser decided to leave and move to London, the other guys decided to stay together, and rather than stay as the Casanovas, they just renamed themselves to the Big Three. And Ringo played his first gig as the official Beatles drummer on the 18th of August at the Port Sunlight Horticultural Society after-show dance at Port Sunlight, Birkenhead. It wasn't Ringo's debut. He'd played a number of times in Hamburg when he was there with Rory Storm, and he often filled in for Pete Best there. And he played his first gig with the Beatles at the Cavern on the 19th of August. It wasn't plain sailing at all. There were lots of chants of "We want Pete, we want Pete." He was a very popular member of the band. And on the 4th of September they were back in the Abbey Road studios for the second version of Love Me Do, and this is obviously the one with Ringo Starr. They recorded a couple of songs that day, Love Me Do and How Do You Do It, and producer George Martin was very keen for the Beatles to release the Mitch Murray penned How Do You Do It as their first single, but they were adamant they wanted to release their own material as a debut single, and they obviously got their own way. And it was just a week or so later, on the 11th, when they recorded Love Me Do for the third time. But this time Andy White was on the drums, because George Martin was not convinced about Ringo's drumming at the second session, which must have made him a tad nervous, having seen what had just happened to Pete Best. So George Martin brought in a drummer he knew from other session work, Andy White. And this is the version of Love Me Do that has Andy White on drums and Ringo on tambourine. Ringo also played maracas on the UK B-side, P.S. I Love You. They also recorded several takes of a new Lennon McCartney song, Please Please Me, and it's a very different arrangement to the one released as the second UK single. It was much more of a slow, Roy Orbison-esque ballad. But sadly no takes survive, so we'll never really know what it sounded like. And on the 5th of October 1962, they released Love Me Do coupled with P.S. I Love You in the UK, their first single on the Parlophone label. It was actually the red label, the very early copies. Well, that's it. That's what the Beatles were up to before Ringo joined. I've been Derek Shelmerdine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unraveled show. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show as much as I have in putting the whole thing together. You can find me on social media at Twitter at RNR Unravel, Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled, and remember you can win a copy of my book, a signed copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unraveled. Go to the website rockandrollunraveled.com, click on the link to competition, and I'll post the lucky winner signed copy of the book anywhere in the world. Good luck with the competition. Join me again next time for another look at a little piece of rock and roll unraveled. Now, to play us out, obviously we'll be playing the Beatles' debut single, Love Me Do. Now, 3 recorded versions exist and all have been released officially. So how do you know which version of Love Me Do you're listening to? It's very straightforward. If the record you're listening to isn't Anthology 1, it ain't Pete Best. That's the only version that's officially released. If you can hear a tambourine, that's Ringo playing it, and Andy White's on drums. That's the third version. And if you can't hear a tambourine, that's Ringo on drums, the second version. But from Anthology 1, this is, and listen out for the different John Lennon harmonica, this is the Beatles' Pete Best version of Love Me Do.